The story of Africa's economic struggle has always been intertwined with the great powers of the world. For centuries, foreign control over resources, trade, and finance has shaped the continent's fate. But in 2025, a new chapter began to unfold, one that shocked the corridors of Washington, rippled through Wall Street, and unsettled the very foundations of the International Monetary Fund. It is a story of bold resistance, centered around a young military leader from Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, who made it clear that Africa would not bend to another form of financial colonization. The latest confrontation erupted over a proposed $3 billion IMF-backed loan package tied directly to Donald Trump's push for a global digital currency system. The idea behind it was to bring Africa under tighter monetary oversight by locking fragile economies into debt while simultaneously enforcing adoption of a new dollar-based digital currency designed to strengthen American financial dominance. On paper, it was marketed as a solution to Africa's liquidity crisis and a way to modernize payment systems. But beneath the surface, it was another version of a debt trap, with rules carefully crafted to secure Washington's grip on African economies for decades. Traoré, who had already risen as a symbol of defiance against neocolonial structures, wasted no time in calling the IMF proposal what it truly was, a trap that would mortgage the continent's future. In private meetings, diplomats from Paris to New York were stunned by the clarity and bluntness of his position. He declared that Africa's resources, its currencies, and its people could not be shackled to systems designed elsewhere and imposed under the guise of modernization. He argued that the so-called aid was little more than a transfer of sovereignty, one that would grant the United States and its institutions the ability to monitor and control African transactions in real time. For Trump, this was more than just a financial instrument. It was a geopolitical weapon. By securing African countries into this IMF package tied to his digital currency, the United States would gain unmatched leverage in trade, energy, and security negotiations. At a time when the global balance of power was shifting and China was deepening its presence across Africa, Washington saw this as an urgent move to keep Africa firmly within its orbit. Yet, what the architects of this plan underestimated was the new confidence sweeping across Africa, a refusal to accept terms dictated from abroad without regard for African agency. Traoré's rejection was not simply symbolic. He convened regional leaders within the alliance of Sahel states, forging consensus that Africa could not afford to become a testing ground for an experiment in financial control. His rhetoric struck a chord across the continent from Mali to Niger, from Kenya to South Africa. The argument was simple but powerful. Every loan comes with strings, but this one came with chains that would bind entire nations to an external digital system where their economic lifelines could be switched off at will. This stance marked a turning point. For decades, leaders had signed IMF packages knowing the austerity measures that followed would devastate their people. But they did so out of fear of currency collapse, fear of investor flight, fear of political isolation. Traoré shattered that fear by reframing the debate. He spoke of sovereignty, of dignity, and of the danger of adopting technologies that were not neutral tools but instruments of geopolitical manipulation. In his speeches, he asked, if Africa's food, fuel, and salaries are processed through a currency controlled abroad, then what independence do we really have? The world reacted quickly. Financial analysts in Europe warned of a dangerous precedent. If Burkina Faso and its allies successfully resisted, other regions might follow. African countries long accustomed to IMF dictates could begin demanding alternatives, whether from China, Russia, or even internal African-led institutions. Washington, meanwhile, feared losing not only financial leverage, but also prestige. Trump's digital currency project was being pitched to the world as the dawn of a new era, and African resistance threatened to expose it as another imperial instrument. Inside Burkina Faso, the decision brought both admiration and anxiety. Supporters hailed Traoré as the man who dared to confront the financial giants on their own terms, a leader who saw through the traps that had ensnared generations. Critics, however, feared isolation, sanctions, and financial retaliation. The IMF had a long history of punishing those who resisted. Yet Traoré doubled down, insisting that Burkina Faso would not starve because of foreign disapproval. Instead, he pointed to Africa's immense natural wealth, gold, oil, gas, agriculture, that could be harnessed for self-sufficiency if managed with discipline and unity. To back his words, Burkina Faso began coordinating with regional banks and finance ministries to explore an African alternative to the IMF loan. The idea was not simply to reject, but to create. Instead of borrowing dollars and tying themselves to Trump's digital currency, they would explore an Afro-digital settlement system built on Africa's own commodities. Gold reserves, agricultural output, and energy projects could form the backbone of a value-based African exchange. While in its infancy, the very announcement of such a plan sent shockwaves through global markets. It symbolized the determination to break free from dependency and chart an independent course. Trump himself, known for his aggressive style, did not take the rejection lightly. Leaks from Washington suggested frustration, even anger, that a leader from a landlocked country in West Africa could publicly defy an initiative supported by the White House and the IMF. Pressure was mounted behind the scenes with threats of aid suspension, travel restrictions, and even the targeting of Burkina Faso's gold exports. But these moves only reinforced Traoré's message that the IMF loan was never about partnership. It was about control. As global media outlets began covering the standoff, the narrative shifted from a financial dispute to a geopolitical battle over the future of African independence. Was Africa destined to remain a subordinate player in the world economy, or could it finally seize its moment to build institutions and systems that served its own people first? Traoré's defiance became a rallying cry not only in Burkina Faso, but also in countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Tanzania, where debates about sovereignty and dependency were already simmering. Economists debated fiercely. Some argued that Africa risked economic collapse by refusing IMF loans, which provided short-term liquidity. Others countered that decades of reliance had produced little beyond cycles of debt, dependency, and underdevelopment. The rejection of the $3 billion deal was thus not reckless. It was visionary. It was the refusal to mortgage tomorrow for a quick fix today. The boldest aspect of Traoré's stand was how it intersected with technology. By blocking Trump's digital currency plan, he highlighted a truth often overlooked. Digital systems are not neutral. They are designed with rules that favor those who build them. If Africa had adopted Trump's system, every transaction, every contract, every import and export could be monitored, paused, or penalized at Washington's discretion. In a world where sanctions had become a common weapon, Africa would have surrendered the little control it had left. Instead, Traoré insisted that Africa must build or co-build any system it intends to use, ensuring transparency and fairness from the ground up. Over time, his resistance attracted unlikely allies. Some European activists criticized the IMF deal as modern-day financial colonization. Economists in Latin America pointed out similarities to the debt traps that had crippled their own economies. Even some U.S. scholars admitted that forcing a digital currency system through conditional loans was ethically questionable. The debate, post-mortem, spread far beyond Africa, raising fundamental questions about who controls the money of the future and who decides the rules of global finance. Within Burkina Faso, Traoré's gamble began to bear fruit. Rather than waiting for foreign loans, the government redirected military spending toward infrastructure, invested in local agriculture to reduce import dependency, and fostered partnerships with African neighbors for trade. Farmers in the countryside began seeing new markets open up as regional cooperation replaced reliance on Western imports. At the same time, universities were tasked with exploring digital finance alternatives rooted in African realities. What began as a rejection turned into a movement of creation, a determination to build rather than borrow. The IMF, of course, did not retreat quietly. Officials warned of instability and hinted at economic isolation. Yet, the more they pushed, the more their threats revealed the very imbalance Traoré had denounced. If loans were truly about partnership, why should rejection bring punishment? If modernization was the goal, why were African voices excluded from designing the system? The questions resonated deeply with ordinary citizens, many of whom had lived through decades of IMF-imposed austerity that cut hospitals, schools, and salaries. This time, they saw a leader willing to say no, and for that, he earned their trust. The story of the blocked $3 billion IMF loan tied to Trump's digital currency is not just about one country or one leader. It is about the struggle of an entire continent to reclaim its right to decide. Traoré's stand will be studied for years to come, not because it solved every problem, but because it lit a path forward. It showed that resistance is possible, that alternatives can be imagined, and that dignity is worth more than borrowed dollars. As the dust settles, one thing is certain: the old playbook of imposing debt and control is no longer working as smoothly as before. Africa has changed. Its people have awakened. And in the heart of Burkina Faso, a young leader has reminded the world that sovereignty cannot be sold, not for $3 billion, not for any digital currency, and not for the comfort of those who have long profited from Africa's submission. In this defiance, Africa has not only blocked a debt trap, but also sparked a conversation about the future of money, power, and independence. The battle is far from over, but the boldness of the answer has already shaken the world.